Hi, I am Dr. Raisul Islam. I have recently completed my PhD from the University of Tasmania in financial economics, focusing on financial technology, regulatory technology, and supervisory technology. I have publications prior to my PhD. During my PhD, I published my thesis chapter titled Crisis Transmission, Visualizing Vulnerability in the Pacific Basin Finance Journal. In addition to that, my other chapters are currently under review in high impact journals. I've recently collaborated with two Canadian professors aiming to complete first draft on a new paper by February 2021. I'm also in the process of submitting my review paper in a high impact journal by the end of this year. I have over 6 years of academic research experience and teaching experience. My job market paper aims to propose a mean to detect how crisis transmits and demonstrate that visually, as well as give us an understanding on how we can stop a crisis from happening. Well, for which we derive systemic risk indices from and use that to generate crisis detection maps. Systemic risk is the risk inherent in a system of entities due to the interconnection between the entities. And there is an overarching perspective when the definitions of systemic risk and contagion are proposed in the literature. However, systemic risk itself is not a threat until it triggers contagion and causes a cascade. An important question arising is that the questions that we have proposed are connected to a key logical argument that enhances our state of knowledge. Here we build upon the growing literature on time-varying systemic risks lying within complex market networks that underpins modern economic network theories. We propose a new perspective into crisis detection with stress classification. We contribute to the state of knowledge in regards to crisis patterns and predictions by limiting the gaps in similar fundamental techniques presented in literature. In terms of policy implications, we experiment by cutting individual links off in the interconnected nets matrix to see the impact of such action. We have used at 30 countries equity market indices spanning over 20 years daily equity return data, and we have selected the samples of these countries following important literature proposed by Asimoglu, Acharya, and Pukthong Thong, and we have covered at least 30 small, medium, and large crises that we have experienced over the last 2 decades. The systemic risk framework that we have used is the Diebold and Yilmaz connectedness index framework that actually estimates a 10-step ahead forecast error variance decomposition matrix from generalized impulse response function. The interconnectedness matrix or the adjacency matrix here gives a squared matrix where diagonally we have own variance shares and non-diagonally we have cross variance shares, and subtracting the diagonal elements to the non-diagonal elements we can easily identify the impact of transmission of shocks and vulnerability due to receiving of shocks. That helps us to generate filtered networks. However, with networks, we can see when there is, if a crisis emerging in USA spreads to Greece, it can take longer for the crisis to propagate to China and vice versa. An important point here to remember is that networks are very dynamic and corresponding to each crisis or even a small event, networks will completely change. And so the literature that proposes that networks are more long-term raises the question of reliability. Although such networks can help us to draw maps such as showing us which countries are more vulnerable to interconnection than others. And hence we decide to propose crisis transmission maps. But first, we experiment with cutting individual links off in the interconnection, and doing that, we have found that when that is not a good strategy, because whenever we cut links off between Germany and India, for example, Indian transmission amplifies, and that holds true for links between Germany and Japan, Germany and Korea, Germany and New Zealand. Now, as opposed to that, when we cut off the links between the USA and Japan, Japanese market's resilience increases, and that holds true for the US and Malaysian links as well, and US and New Zealand link. Now, coming back to the self-organizing maps or crisis maps, these are fundamental pattern recognition process that gives us intrinsic intra and inter-pattern relationships between the stimuli and responses, and are presented topologically. And that is drawn from this function where there is we measure the loss function by taking the distance between input node and randomly generated synaptic weights. And as you can see, this is a updating algorithm giving us a recursive iterative process and a predictive with that predictive data generative process. With that, we have proposed topographic image of the networks, and we see that uh, while all these markets are highly connected, when there is a crisis emerging in Asian markets, and that is reflected in the American market, and if you are a regulator located in Norway, you can easily see that how much longer it will take the shock to transmit from USA to Norway, and you have enough time to cut off the link and short circuit a crisis from happening. And however, as this is also dynamic and not a static matter, we take a windowed approach in generating these network maps, and we find some interesting features. For example, in line with literature proposed by Farhis Diabolic and Doomloop and Mui 2007's proposed feedback loops, every time we detect a feedback loop forming in our system, identifies that the next period you'll have cracks on the plateau, and a crisis, as you can see, has emerged globally. So as a regulator, you will just need to look out for feedback loops forming in the system, and that will signal you to prepare for a crisis arriving. However, how can that help a risk manager? As a portfolio manager who is rebalancing the portfolio with different combination of assets, can continue to rebalance the portfolio until maps propose least cracks on the plateau. And with least cracks, the combination of asset is the best combination, that reduces the exposure to risk. And for a regulator, regulators can experiment with alternative intervention pathway and see which causes the cracks to drop. Now with that, we also produce tables that is extracted from self-organizing maps, and we can see that feeding the system data up until 2010, the system was correctly identifying crisis generating in 2012 the European debt crisis period and the Chinese stock market crash, as well as the aftermath of Russian ruble crisis is also detected. So we have proposed tools that regulators can use to not only identify and detect a crisis um, arriving, but also allows the regulators to stop a crisis before it reaches its own on country's market, and also allows the risk managers a good strategy to find the best combination, reducing the exposure to risk. Thank you for your patience. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. I would love to receive questions and love to discuss more about this with you.